Hello, welcome to the afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Benjamin Brower, who is an associate professor of history at University of Texas at Austin, and is the author of a book called Desert Named Peace: The Violence of France's Empire in the Algerian Sahara, 1844 to 1902. Ben, welcome to afikra.
Thanks, Mikey, and thanks for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here with you.
It is an honor to have you. So, all right. This is, I think I told you this before, but this is a subject that I'm embarrassed how little I know about the subject, because I feel like the story of colonialism in Algeria has an outsized relevance to my current day life. And I have a embarrassingly little amount of information inside my brain. So I'm using you very much to help rectify this problem. But before we do, maybe just answer, why did you get interested in this topic and decide to research it and write a book about it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, unlike a lot of your guests, it's a wonderful series that you have here. And unlike a lot of your guests, I don't really have a personal connection to the place to begin with. I'm not the child of freedom fighters. Don't come from a French settler background. My grandfather wasn't a colonel in the French army. These sorts of things. I grew up in a place actually that probably a lot of your listeners will have to look up on the map, which is the state of Idaho in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so it's a pretty far off place from Algeria, but it was a place that has a lot of connections with Algeria. I first went to Algeria and spent some time there, about 2000, about 25 years ago. And it was a place that I'd been told would be so different and so exotic. And it was also a country that at the time was just coming out of a civil war. And so there's a great deal of, the security situation was not clear at all. But in any case, it was, I went there with some friends who called themselves the coyotes, the coyote in French. And this was not, this was a self-deprecating understanding of themselves from the Wile E. Coyote and the cartoons that chases after the Roadrunner. Yeah. And, always falls off the edge of the cliff. And, so these are people who'd grown up during the war and, had a pretty difficult youth, to say the least. In any case, there were people that I felt completely at home with. There were people that I'd grown up with in this rural state. It was also, they felt themselves completely cut off from the world. And growing up in Idaho, we felt the same way. And so these sorts of connections, the history of the U.S. West is a colonial one as well. And so intellectually, there was a lot of traction connections that you can make. The history of Idaho is one of massacres of Native Americans, of the Bear Lake Massacre in 1863. It was not far from where I grew up. These sorts of things. And anyway, that was one of the ways that I connected very, very quickly with the place and the people.
Yeah. It is a universal story, actually. And in many ways, in some ways in the Western world, and a couple of days ago, I was having a conversation about, the erasure that took place by the Russian Empire in the steppes. In some ways, in those places, it's almost hidden, even in plain sight. But yeah, it's a universal story. Can I jump directly into the title of the book, A Desert
Sure.
Named Peace? So first, the two questions I have is, one, why that title? And two, what is relevant about the dates 1844 to 1902?
Sure. Well, the title comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, and he was writing a critical history of Roman conquests in today's Britain. And so that was one thing, he sort of said, we came here, we destroyed the place, we planted our flag, and we say that this is a land of peace now. And, that's a lot echoed a lot with the way that the French approached Algeria. And in particular, there's with the Sahara, the book deals with the conquest of the French conquest or expansion of the Sahara. They had a narrative that developed around different sorts of aesthetic or approaches to the environment. There are two different ways in which the French understood the Sahara. One is a place of violence, of hunger, thirst, a wasteland understanding. But they also plugged in these idioms of pastoralism. And, this is the sort of stuff that's the tourist imagery of today is made up of swaying palm trees, gurgling springs, and so forth. And that latter image was very, very important in enabling the first, why are we here? The French would ask themselves. And one of the reasons would be is because this is a land that we're going to develop. This is a land that we will have a peaceful expansion into. So sort of ideological framing of conquest is as a peaceful one, right? And, this is not unique to the Saharan. Pacification is this, whenever you read this in the text and it's used in situations of such violence, some of this is coming out of these, the Saharan conquest.
So what about those dates?
Yeah, so the dates is the 1844 is when the French have been in Algeria since 1830, primarily restricted to a couple of port cities on the Mediterranean. The capital Algiers primarily, where they first overthrew the Ottoman leadership, and as part of there's a series of wars that generated Algerians taking up arms, the most famous of which is by the Emir Abdelkader. Yeah. And as part of the war strategy to put down the Emir, the idea was that the war had to be expanded, right? And most of the Emir struggles are in the north, but the French army, I guess it's sort of, in military terms, sort of outflanking. We have to move into the Sahara to cut off this place that might serve as refuge for the Emir and his forces. And also related and unrelated to the Emir struggle are a series of local revolts that take up arms against the French. Most of them undertaken under some sorts of idioms of final days, the apocalyptic traditions of Islam, and particularly the Mahdi figure, people who rally people around them, saying they have a special relationship to God, and that this is the end of the times. French conquest is a period of catastrophe, and I will lead you in a violent struggle that will lead to redemption at the end of times in a period of justice. And so some of these people are showing up in the Sahara. It's the French movement. And then 1902 is the moment when the French army sort of literally and metaphorically plants its flag in the farthest southern oases that will become the Algerian Sahara, places around Ain Salah, which is an oil and farming region, still home to pastoralists, and so this is where they sort of seal things off and call it good.
Okay, I want to continue defining some terms for a second. In light of what has been happening in Palestine, I can feel a global discourse around what does sort of colonial violence look like, and does what is happening in Palestine constitute? And for me, I feel super comfortable using the term. I use it all the time. And what's happening is this is just textbook colonial violence. And then, but in the book, you actually try to define this term. So from your perspective, how are you using that term, and how do you think people should think about that term?
That's a big question. Well, let me start with the way that some of the problems that I faced. So the book came out in 2009, and most of it was written. That's part of a dissertation I did at Cornell University in the 2000s. And at that time, colonial violence was not something that was really on the radar of the field of historians. They were looking more in terms of what would broadly called accommodation studies. People who were influenced by James Scott's work on Southeast Asian peasants and the weapons of the weak, and how colonizers and colonized lived together, right? Not that they collaborated. In fact, they were trying to get beyond the nationalist paradigm that said that if you don't take up arms against the colonizer, that you're a collaborator of some sort. And so that's where a lot of scholarship, and at least English language scholarship, was going. You know, there were even historians who were writing, important historians who were writing about, you know, violence is just a way that Europeans get empire on the cheap. You know, and I'm looking at the sources, and there's nothing cheap at all in any way, shape, or form about the conquest of Algeria. You know, it's by any measure, it's an incredibly costly undertaking, and there were much cheaper ways to do it. Violence was actually, from the French perspective, certainly from the Algerian perspective, the most costly way to go about this. So that was one thing that was happening in the field. And I wanted to use violence as a category of historical analysis, right? Not something that falls out of different political processes or social movements. I wanted to put violence at the front and center of what I did as a historian.
Wait, can you explain that? Imagine you're speaking to like a 15-year-old.
Sure.
What do you mean by that? Putting it at front and center and sort of creating a category. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, let me talk to a pretty well-educated 15-year-old.
Okay, I'll be that. I'll be that pretty well-educated 15-year-old.
You know, historians, the social sciences and many parts of the humanities have difficulty approaching violence as a topic. I think anthropologists over time have been the best in doing that. But historians will look at something, you know, like say the violence of the French Revolution, for example. And they will say that, the violence can be understood if we look at politics, right? And I'm going to write a political history. And violence will sort of show up in the footnotes of this. There are people getting killed, and I, as a historian, will tally them up and so forth. But I'm not really, it's almost occurring off the pages a little bit. And so I wanted to read these texts in a way that, in terms of the French context, someone like historian Natalie Zeman Davis, who is a very important historian, and she was working at the French Wars of Religion, and she was doing a lot of work through anthropology. And so she sort of like read these events and read them not only for causation, right, that there's peasants fighting against the nobility or something along those lines, but sort of, you know, take a fine-tooth comb through the sources and try to read motivations and also, you know, sort of think about violence as a language, right? What are people saying to each other when they commit these violent acts? And so another person that's important in this, who called for, you know, violence to be at the front and center of what we do as scholars, is Hannah Arendt. And so I was reading her at the time, and so that seemed very, very important. So that's one part of it. And then as the book was getting into completion, there was a book that came out in France and hasn't been translated yet by a historian named Olivier Le Cour-Grandmaison. And he was taking some ideas. He was looking at Algeria, pretty superficial reading of the sources, my opinion. He didn't go to the archives. He was reading published sources. He was sort of reading for some pretty obvious themes that were going on with them, but they were obvious, but no one else was doing this, right? And so this is the importance of his work. And what he was trying to do is, under Arendt, is he was trying to think about the violence that was happening in Algeria in reference to the violence that happened in the Holocaust in the middle of the 20th century in Europe. And he sort of talked about this in terms of a red thread, right? There was a sort of automatic link. In any case, there was a big blow up in France around this book. And people, French historians, very powerful French historians, sort of asked the question like, well, what is colonial about violence? I can find everything that the Cour Grandmaison sees in Algeria, I can find in attacks on the working classes, you know, just sort of ordinary stuff, right? There's nothing particularly colonial about this violence. It's just the violence of modernity. Yeah. And I thought that, you know, it had a silent effect on the field, actually, which was quite chilling, especially as a young historian going into it like myself. And there was just something fundamentally wrong about it that these French historians didn't get. What these were people who know colonialism extremely well, but there was something about it they just didn't quite get.
Yeah.
And so what is colonial about it is, even the terms and the way that it's conceptualized. So you were talking about, the French Empire, and you're interviewing me from Beirut, and which was part of the French Empire at one point. And what's unique or distinctive, not really unique, but distinctive about Algeria is the fact that it was, as the French said in the 1950s, and had been saying for a long time, that Algeria is France, right? And this is what the French government's response was when the FLN started the revolution on the 1st of November, 1954. Like, well, there's no Algeria there. This is France, right? And there's no Algerian people. There's a bunch of tribes and these sorts of things. And from a legal perspective, notwithstanding the tribes, but the Algeria, territorially speaking, was France. And they'd claimed it with some ambiguity in the first decades in the 1830s, and then increasingly more openly in the middle of the 19th century, that Algeria, was assimilated as part of something of an exaggeration, but it's as France as Normandy or as Paris or these sorts of places. But what they didn't do, they took Algeria, the territory, but they did not make the people who lived there French, right? And so these are the sorts of things. The Algerians really didn't have a resolved legal status until 1865, 35 years after the French had been there. The French had dissolved, defeated the Ottoman state. They didn't recognize any other state forces there. So the Algerians were essentially stateless for 35 years. And then when they are made French, they're naturalized as French subjects, but not French citizens, right? Which means that in concrete terms, what it means is those aspects of French law that recognized rights, political, civic, civil rights, only a tiny modality of these were made available to these Algerians, who they called natives, indigènes. And that's a term that's used. It's a legal category. And it also, kind of like a dozen eight teeth, it speaks a lot about the way that the French understood them. And for indigène in French language is archaic, backward, tribal. I think I do have a quotation marks around tribal when I use that, because when the French use it, the tribe is something much different than the way that they envision it. And also in the 19th century, the native is something that is, many people thought at the time, was slated for destruction and disappearance. Right? These sorts of discourses of auto-genocide that are quite popular among some people in the 1800s.
Okay. I want to try to get through the different parts of the book, and kind of just use you, if you're okay with it, to help guide us through these four parts and some of the different periods in history. So maybe we can start with part one, and I'll just use the dates, and then you can sort of, if you will, just explain kind of the framework of what you're trying to untangle, and how you think readers should walk away from this. So the first dates are 1844 to 1952. And you talk about this like peaceful expansion of total conquest, which sounds like a paradox.
So you said 1952, but 1902?
1844 to 1852.
Oh, okay. So this is the military conquest of the northern Sahara, and it closes with this very brutal taking of an oasis called Laguat or Alaguat in the northern Sahara, southern Algeria, and in 1852, where basically there's an Algerian figure who rallies local people in a rebellion. And the French decide that the solution to this is to put most everyone to the sword, and which they do once they pierce the oasis fortifications. it is, it's a sort of the violence of this is interesting because it's a sort of violence of first resort. There are many different ways in which the French politically, diplomatically, could have approached these problems. But they choose almost always a military solution to them. And it's one of the reasons for that is Algeria is France, but administratively it's a military colony. And so military thinkers, it's so much built into the DNA of the place. There's a figure called the Governor General who has very expansive powers, and at many points in this early history is ruling kind of on his own, irrespective of what the government in Paris says. And so, it's easy enough for them to send one of their expeditionary columns down and put people to the sword. So they do this. They also the logistics of it contribute to the violence of this period. There's they don't send these expedition columns down with enough supplies. They have to sort of feed themselves off of the land. Mm-hmm. And the mode of economic exchange they use, they don't trade with local people to get fodder for their horses or foodstuffs for themselves. They just take it. And so this also contributes to it. Some quite nasty stuff. A lot of the resources that they want are hidden. And so even at this early period, torture shows up in the history of the conquest. Like, where are your silos located? And so there's one doctor in particular, a French military doctor, who writes about the torture of this old woman, and they're looking for the silos. And this also sort of speaks about the sources. The sources are hard to come by in the sense sometimes there are very few Algerian sources, or the sources that exist are usually around political negotiations, letters that the French have intercepted, talking about political maneuverings or military maneuverings, right? There's no like sort of first person accounts about that have shown up of people who experienced this. And, sometimes the French sources will speak very candidly, like this military doctor did, but most of the time all this stuff goes unsaid. And there certainly are not orders, sort of explicit orders to go and exterminate a population somewhere. This takes place in another frame of discourse around the conquest, but not in sort of, there's not a smoking gun sort of scenario.
Okay, so I know that this is not part of your the like jurisdiction of writing this book, or probably maybe even within your skill set, but do you have a sense of the psychology or like what people are thinking at the time, both the colonizers as well as the indigenous Algerians who are there? What is the discourse, the actual conversation? What is the discourse at the time?
Well, it's mixed. The big question, the most significant question in all of this is questions around what the French call extermination. And this is a word that, like all words, it has a history and changes over time, but it's not that far from what we would understand extermination to mean today. The 19th century, it means some sort of demographic collapse or large-scale expulsion, migration. And for the most part, the dominant opinion to this in metropolitan France is that this is something that the France cannot do as a state, cannot do. The example they typically use going forward is the United States. The United States exterminated Native Americans, and that this is a bar that this is a threshold that France will not pass. It's in opposition to fundamental values, which are for these people are sort of liberal values, and so forth. The military is also, although they're doing the work of this, are in terms of small scale massacres, are not so interested in this project either. They think it's going to be too costly. They don't really recoil from the violence or the ethics of it, although some of them do, actually. And I talk about these people in the book at length, French officers who are horrified by what's going on. And but the higher ranks, people who are calling the shots on a strategic level, they're looking at things like the labor question. If we exterminate everyone, who's going to do the work that we need? We can't. European settlers had not been doing well in terms of being able to stay healthy and alive in Algeria.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things that they're considering. And so they're doing the work. They're making it possible to even conceive of this sort of stuff. But at the high command, there's a letter that I found by the Governor General, the leader of the French military forces, guy by the name of Bugeaud, who writes to a colleague and says, "No, we can't exterminate to work for us.
Now we can't exterminate, or now we can?
We can't. We're not going to do this because we need Algerians here to provide the labor for French colonization."
So it's essentially there's like three camps. There's the we can and we should but we can't, and we can't and we shouldn't. There's the people who are saying that this shouldn't happen no matter what, right? And these are the liberals in Paris who are saying they're the you can't handle the truth people.
But a lot of those liberals, so these are people like Tocqueville, the classic French liberal democracy in America person. And he is ready to, he writes a lot on Algeria, and he is ready to go to very extreme lengths to pacify the country, as he would have called it, right? So he doesn't shirk from that. But if you asked him, does this include the total annihilation of all Algerians? And he said, "Oh, no, of course not."
It would include like enslavement. That's what...
not legally speaking, not for Tocqueville. Yeah. But there are other people there's one of the third camps. It's somewhat marginal, but they're very frightening when you know what happens later. Come out of the medical field, actually. There's this one person that I've been working on for some time. His name's Dr. Baudichon, Eugene Baudichon. And he's a leftist doctor, comes to Algeria, first decade or so of the colonization. And by the 1840s, he's thinking about this in sort of medical demographic terms, and that there's a racial divide between Europeans and Algerians, and they're on the side of barbarism and destruction, retrograde, and for progress to happen. Sort of frames this in the way he's talking about Algeria, but he's thinking more writ large. For progress in the world to happen, these archaic populations have to be eliminated. And and he talks about this in very graphic terms, right? And people are reading him, especially his fellow people are thinking about population sciences, demographers, a lot of these people are doctors. They're reading him, and he's useful for them to have the conversation in terms of planning. But certainly, if you're thinking about mass violence in its modern iteration, you see someone like this, and you see these sort of echoes in the 20th century. Now, the important thing to remember, though, is this is, history is not a series of red threads from one place to another, and the links between Baudichon and the Holocaust are not direct at all. And so as one possibility, he opens this sort of thinking up in the minds of people, and there are certain fields in which these sorts of discourses take traction and become acceptable, but they're not, sort of writ large, right? They're not writ large, and they're very controversial. And yes, Baudichon, I certainly don't see Baudichon as a proto-Nazi or someone who's leading into it, but he's an important part of the configuration, the constellation of forces that produce this mass violence in the 20th century, racialized violence.
At what point do the sort of resistance movements arise in Algeria against this? And maybe do they even predate French, the French colonialism, and do they predate them and exist during Ottoman occupation?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a good way to put it back before 1830. Or 1830 is such an important date, but there's a lot happening in North Africa before that. And there are a lot of, if you go in a place like Emir Abdelkader, he's from Western Algeria. And in the decades leading up to the French period, to the colonial period, a lot of people off the coast have been organizing to protect their autonomy from the Ottomans, to rebel against the Ottomans. There are some who say that the Ottomans are impious and have to be stopped. There are revolts taking place in eastern Algeria. So, people are already mobilized. They know how to work militarily. In some cases, they have a chain of command or leadership that folds itself into the anti-colonial resistance. But certainly the anti-colonial resistance against the French starts immediately. I mean, there's large armies that the Ottomans find going to the field under Ottoman banners in 1830. The Ottoman specifically Ottoman resistance continues until the end of the 1830s. There's an Ottoman governor in this eastern city, very important city, Constantine, and he continues to fight the French in the name of the Ottoman Empire until he's defeated. And even then, he sort of continues to fight for a number of years when he's unseated from the capital. Yeah, and this is ongoing, and the Algerian nationalist historiography places this at the centerpiece, an undying flame of Algerian resistance. And they take a lot of flack for that. It's an ideological vision of things, but there's a certain truth to what they're saying, right? That if we understand resistance, not necessarily large-scale armies like Emir Abdelkader was able to field until he's defeated, but small-scale revolts. I'm not even talking here about James C. Scott stuff, sort of weapons of the weak. I'm talking about people who use, violence as a form of resistance. This is ongoing until 1962 in many different parts of the country. So so that's kind of important to keep in mind when thinking about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder when did the resistance movements become popular resistance movements? When did it begin to sort of formulate into something that everyone locally felt some sort of ownership? And maybe never. Maybe the answer is it didn't.
Yeah, it's. The big sort of the way in which the language you use, I would probably sometime after 1954, years after the FLN started, when they can really stand as at the head of a mass movement. But certainly, the Emir Abdelkader is one of these moments. He's a war off and on with the French until he's defeated in 1847, and he has substantial support across the country, but not everywhere. And people are questioning, especially as it looks like his violence and the sacrifices that it entails on the part of the Algerian side will not be victorious. And he's a very persuasive person. He's one of the things that comes across virtually everyone who works on the Emir is his integrity and his respect for the law. He's really a man of principles and thinking. And the banner under which he wages his war is jihad. And so he says, as Muslims, it is incumbent upon us, right? He's not using so much national terms like the Algerian nation is outside of his thinking. He's looking at the community of the first Muslims the Prophet and the companions and the first Muslim, is saying, this is my model, this is my inspiration. And it gives us intellectually and politically everything that we need to move forward, with this project. And so, jihad, one of the sort of things that makes jihad possible is the expectation, at least as I understand the jurists who are writing about this, is the expectation it will be successful. This isn't a suicide mission, that it has a political logic to it and it has reasonable expectations of success. And so, Algerians who are thinking about this, do we respond? Do we fight with the Emir against the French? He's incredibly dangerous for us. At one point they solicited a legal opinion, a fatwa.
Mm-hmm.
I know about this because the French intercepted it, picked it up, and made a big deal about it. But the scholar they consulted said, from what you're telling me, the Emir probably does not have a chance of success, reasonable chance of success. And so, no, it's not incumbent upon you as Muslims to follow his movement, right? So there's a great deal of fragmentation. It's not a sort of like a mass uprising that we would like to see. The story is much messier than that. Although it is significant, and not to underwrite this. It doesn't sort of move Algeria towards a Algerian war, so sort of civil war that's going on. Although this many times has happened. One of these things, when you look at colonial violence, basically many different situations, there's always wars within wars. And, it's always, historians always have to keep our eyes focused, not only on sort of like the main text that's going on here in terms of these conflicts, but also what's spinning off from this.
Before we keep on going, just for people who are listening, can you give us a scale of the colonial violence over the course of this period? As you've said, it can take many different shapes. It can sort of be implemented in many different ways. But how do you think about the scale?
In terms of the loss of life?
Yeah.
So, look, there are lots of different numbers that circulate from the sources, and I base my understandings from the conclusions of an Algerian demographic historian, Kamel Kata, who a really important book a couple of decades ago, where he looked at as a demographic history of Algeria. And he estimates that there were about 800,000 people, Algerians, who were killed or emigrated as a result of direct military confrontations. And then about another 800,000 people who died as a result of disease, famine, subsistence crises that I can see are directly related to the violence of the military conquest. And so we're looking here on this, around 1.5, 1.6 people who, again, were either killed, who emigrated, and likely he's also calculating. Doesn't go through all the way in which he comes to his conclusions for the reader, but likely, in terms of declining birth rates and these sorts of things, also that impact the population. So that's the figure, and we're talking about a total population that anywhere between 2 and 4 million people. Historians typically split the difference on that and talk about, the population of Algeria in 1830 is about 3 million.
So like half of the population was killed?
Yeah.
And
so this is why Baudisson can sort of envision a disappearing population, right? He's already sort of seen it. It's already happened before his eyes.
What percentage of the population was enslaved?
So no one is. France doesn't abolish slavery until 1848. Throughout its overseas possessions, and France doesn't practice slavery in Algeria. Doesn't from a legal perspective, at least, it doesn't enslave people as it had in the Caribbean and, the whole slave trade and history of land expansion. It doesn't do this. It's, in some ways I can see the writing on the wall that abolition is coming, although there are people who talk about this, but mainly the way that the slavery discourses in French planning, come up is in terms of, bringing sub-Saharan Africans of color into North Africa as a labor source, right? So this is one of the ways, and this is, again, Bodichon talks about this. If we kill off all the Algerians, well, we'll replace them with Black Africans who will come in and take their place, and we will emancipate them. They'll be grateful towards the mother country, France, for giving their freedom and all this sort of stuff that he uses. And, but there is, of course, indigenous forms of slavery, that exist. And I don't know if we have a count of how many estimates of how many people are enslaved in Algeria. What the French do, up until 1848, slavery is legal. For Algerians, Muslim Algerians to own a slave is legal. 1848 is not legal, but in most cases, the French will turn a blind eye on it. A lot of the enslaved people are in the Sahara, so this is kind of far off for the French, and so it's easy enough to conceal. And even in the cities, it's slaves are typically deeply embedded in the family, and owners can pass them off if anyone asks, which no one ever does. If they're enslaved, say, "Well, that's my wife," and so forth. And slaves themselves are the most active people in reclaiming their own freedom. We know this as historians. And in many cases, they do go forward to French authorities right after 1848 and claim their freedom. And then the response that they get is varied. It depends. I'm speaking about the Sahara here.
Yeah.
If the French want to have good relations with the master or the particular community where this person lived, sometimes they'll send them back. They don't. There's not much of an effort of abolition, except with people who are opposed or potentially hostile to the French. Then yes, they will intercept slave caravans. They will slaves that free for their freedom. The French will keep them, provide safety and security for them. So it's a very instrumental way in which abolition is used.
You mentioned something earlier. You said, Algeria was technically part of France as far as France was concerned. It wasn't, it wasn't a colony in the same way that maybe, Haiti or Lebanon as a mandate was. But Algerians weren't given full rights. What is the history behind that? How did that legal structure emerge? And
well,
why? Why did it emerge too?
Yeah, the short answer to this is a little bit like listeners in the United States will know probably something in the history of Puerto Rico, and a lot of these European empires, especially the ones that are based upon the principle of rights and citizenship, they go out into the world and they want to have the resources. The territorial resources, land, strategic value that this place on the map represents to them, but they don't want to. So they want to plant the flag in that respect. They don't want to incorporate the people that live there, right? And so you should take the land, but leave the people sort of response. And so this is, broadly speaking, represents the way that France approached Algeria. This changes legally after the Second World War, when, for all intents and purposes, from a legal perspective, again speaking, Algerians are French, right? One of the last modalities of Frenchness that the Algerians don't have is the women's right to vote, which doesn't come until Algerian women can't vote until 1958. But up until that point, so there's this law of 1865 where Algerians, at this point, Muslims and Jews, are both considered indigene natives, and they are naturalized as French as subjects, but not citizens. And you can, when you read the language of the law and the debates around it, you can see that there's a great deal of tension around this.
What is the difference between a French subject and a French citizen?
It's a question of rights, right? So being this notion of citizenship, this is I have to sort of take a detour through the weeds here a little bit, more of the history. And what we know as citizen is really only taking shape in the first decades of the 19th century. Right? We sort of date this concept to the French Revolution, where it emerges, where the citizen is a member of a national community and is thereby automatically endowed with what they call natural rights, right? Being a member of a nation, one accedes to the status of a rights-bearing citizen. But it's not really clear how this works out. And so, one of the early cases, the big test case for the whole thing is, what about women? Women by the French civil code do not enjoy equality before the law. They're excluded from a whole range of rights that men have. And, so there are people who are talking, these jurists are talking in the early 19th century, like, well, should we call women citizens? What are they really? They're French, but are they citizens? And the response to that is no. They're not citizens. They're French by nationality, but they're not citizens because they don't have access to full array of rights. And so this carries over into the way that colonized people are approached. Right? They've already made the exception for women, and so they can make this exception again for colonized people. Although, as I said, when you read the language of the law, there's a great deal of tension around this. Right? So the word subject, for example, never appears in the text. They're talking about a different modality of rights. So in 1865, Algerians who have been stateless and have no nationality that we as the French government recognize become French. But they're barred from the full array of rights. And the reason they're done so is based upon their religion. Right? Jews and Muslims have access to confessional family law in terms of how divorce, inheritance, these sorts of things, which are very, very important to these communities. And unless these people, speaking with the voice of the French planner, these people renounce this and accept the French civil code, they can't be French, right? So by virtue of being Muslim or Jew, this bars their access to French citizenship. This is the logic that is used to close this gate. In 1870,
and we see vestiges of that still in French,
yeah.
in French logic.
Yeah. One of the things, the historian, this is just an aside, but you can't wash this stuff out. Once you do this stuff, it's around for a long, long time. The precedent is set, and the legacies of these sorts of decisions. And these are just people who have power at a particular moment in time. There are other people who say no, that the Algerians have to have full citizenship. Right? They don't win the day, and we're still with the effects of this a century later. So anyway, the whole story includes the Jews acceding to full citizenship in 1870. There's a decree that's made in France. They don't really ask if they want to do this or not. They just become French. And this is not open to Algerians, although there are plans to try to do this. And at this point, many cases, Algerians refuse this because they don't want to give up the ability to decide family matters through Islamic law. Right? They want to maintain this. And, if they're not full French citizens, then so be it. This is what's important to us as Muslims. This is the core of our identity, right? Is this family law. And so this continues until like I said, this is largely dismantled at the end of the Second World War.
Interesting. We're like running out of time. I wanted to ask you about a couple of the key figures, and you mentioned Abdelkader, who's a figure who I feel like I misunderstand. So I want to ask you to describe what people should understand about him and what people most misunderstand about his role and his legacy.
Yeah, he's a person that's been He's a story that's been written over many times by many different forces. The French eventually embrace the Emir, and particularly after he intervenes in, he ends up in Damascus. He spends a number of years in French prisons after 1847, and then he's allowed to emigrate to the Ottoman Empire, and he ends up in Damascus, where he sets up as a household. He has students, he's a teacher, and so forth. And he intervenes in the 1860s to protect Christian communities in Damascus. There was popular violence that was going on. Well, it's around the Mount Lebanon uprising.
Mm-hmm.
And so he intervenes at that point, and so he's embraced as a person who was tolerant to the sort of way in which the French, strangely enough, claim him as an example of the success of what they call the civilizing mission, right? As if this choice that he made was determined by his contact with the French, and somehow he became more French. But of course, this is not what he's doing at all. Anyway, so that's part of the story that's instrumentalized French reading. They also are trying to cultivate him to be a leader, an Islamic leader that's allied to France. He's very careful in staying away from all of this. What I know, there's the Algerian nationalist embrace of him as the forger of the Algerian state. The first Algerian state, authentic Algerian state, was forged by the Emir Abdelkader in the 1840s. And, part of this includes repatriating the Emir's body. He'd been buried in Damascus. And second Algerian president, Boumediene, repatriates his remains to Algiers, where he's buried today, claiming him as the father of the Algerian nation. There's also, and this is fallen away largely, but he's also a big figure for the British and Americans at the time. And, they embrace him as a freedom fighter against French oppression, French imperialism. And sort of like the anti-Bonapartism influence of some of this. And, this is part of the story that people in the know, but maybe your listeners do not. There's a small town in Iowa that's named Algeria, Iowa, and it was founded in the 19th century. It's named in honor of the Emir Abdelkader, this Algerian leader.
No way! Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I basically have two more questions I want to try to squeeze in. So one is, what is the blue legend?
So the blue legend refers to the Tuareg people, who are a Berberophone society, very, very complex and dispersed, that live in the Sahara. Today they're found all across the region. So what we call today the Sahel, Mali, southern Algeria, Niger, and other countries along that frontier. And in the 19th century, the French first get contact with them. The Tuareg sent some emissaries to this oasis that the French have conquered. And things have changed. They understand this. The way that they immediately feel it is they feel the Ottoman presence coming down from Tripoli into the Sahara. The Ottomans are set up or will set up soon a military base in an oasis called Ghat. And so it's not a particularly welcome presence for the Tuareg. They know that the French are in Algeria, they're powerful. And so they send some emissaries there to open some negotiations and try to figure out, where they are in this new 19th century dominated by these outsiders, or these outside forces encroaching. And a whole mythology develops around this. And the book deals with one French figure, Henri Duveyrier, who spent some time with the Tuareg and writes a very influential book about it. And he depicts them. The blue legend is this positive Orientalist stereotype in a nutshell that the French develop around the Tuareg, that they are honest, upright, and that they're natural allies of France in the Sahara. So whenever we get around to a trans-Saharan imperial project, the Tuareg will be there as our allies just because of who they are, right? And, if you read between the lines of Duverier's account, the Tuareg sort of see him as kind of a curiosity, an outsider. And, he has one scene, he's somewhat humiliated by the women are laughing at him and coming in to peek in and see who he is. And the way I interpret this in the book is he was very ill too, at one point. And it's a way in which he sort of negotiates what he thinks should be the power relationships between Europeans and non-Europeans, right? Where he should be on top and the commander and so forth. And the sort of psychological response to his own weakness and fragility and his own sense of being vulnerable while he's there. And anyway, it's very, very influential. And then, so this is in the 1860s. And then the French don't really get moving to go far, far south with the Tuareg until 20 years later. And they largely they don't keep up relations with the Tuareg. They don't send emissaries down there. They don't keep communications. But because they know the Tuareg is this fixed and unchanging entity, right? They're not a political people. They don't have political aspirations. They just are a sort of, a sort of ethnographic creation of Duvalier. And a lot has been going on in the 20 years, and Tuareg's politics have changed. And, but the French don't pay attention to this because they've created who the Tuareg are, this blue legend. And they send a railroad expedition, survey expedition down in the 1880s. And the Tuareg tell them, or certain leaders within the Tuareg say, it's very, very dangerous. Don't come, don't come, don't come. And the leader of that ignores all of this with the idea of the blue legend. And, they're intercepted, they're engaged in battle. The French, and it's a mixed French, Arab Algerian force, they're forced to retreat back. And, it ends very disastrously. It's one of these 19th century cannibalism stories. People resort to eating each other to stay alive in their space. And then there becomes a black legend. The Tuareg are not the good guys. They must be annihilated, must be eradicated.
Wow. Okay, my last question is about this idea of extermination. You use this, we already talked about it a little bit, but there's a quote in your book, and it's a French person. The quote is, following a series of bloody encounters with Walid Ataya near Philippeville, I don't know how to say this guy's name, Montagnec, describes, and then this is the quote, how to make war on Arabs as follows: kill all the men down to age 15, take all the women and children, put them on boats and send them to Marquise Islands or somewhere else in the world, annihilate all of who will not grovel at our feet like dogs. Reading something like this is chilling, but it's not foreign to me. I hear, especially now, I hear phrases and things like that come out of the media. As a historian, how much of what is happening now rhymes with what was happening in Algeria at the time?
Well, as I said earlier, the Montagnec quote I think is best understood as a sort of what we call war porn, right? War pornography that's written by participants in wars, perpetrators, people with guns. And it celebrates their virility, their sexuality, their ruthlessness. And oftentimes it's internal to them, sort of like internal to them. We only share this amongst ourselves, sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But some of the Montagnec letters and another officer like Montagnec, we know about this stuff because they published it. We didn't find this in some private correspondence somewhere. Publishers saw this as a text that had a market, and even though it's not the mainstream, you can sell this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so the Montagnec quote is infamous in the sources, right? It's used a lot to illustrate this sort of hate and rage that goes along with particular modality of French colonialism. And in terms of where this connects today, I think that, I said earlier, the stuff doesn't come out in the wash. Once these things occur and once people make the decision to engage in mass violence and to allow themselves to give over to such sorts of hates and emotions and so forth, in many ways, it's not a slippery slope. People choose to do this. And, they're making decisions, and we, people afterwards, just still live with those decisions. And, there's not, again, the red line thesis, the sort of genocide from Sparta to Darfur understandings. As a historian, no, I don't see that. I think that, historian of violence in particular, every instance of violence has to be read on its own terms. And they almost invariably are a very unique case and has to be understood by a very, very close reading of what's going on in particular context. Of course, they need to be put in comparison with other examples, other cases. But the idea of, some sort of red thread or a sort of highway from one event to the other in the darkness of the past to the present the historian just doesn't hold up. But there are very, very deep legacies that are part of this. One of the things that emerges among FLN, so these are the Algerian nationalists who led the struggle for independence, which they won in 1962. They have debates around their struggle is a very, very violent one, and included violence against people they not necessarily recognize as their enemy. And there's debates around this, and debates are, we cannot maintain ourselves and our principles and what we want Algeria to be if we resort to killing women and children, right? You're just talking both about European settler women and children, but also Algerian women and children who the FLN had targeted as traitors and so forth. You don't that doesn't wash itself out at the end. And also from the French case, the French so I'm talking here about 54 to 62, the Algerian Revolution, it'd be 350,000 Algerians, civilians, people who were not carrying weapons or in uniform, were killed by the French security forces, and we talk about these as Algerians, but legally speaking, they're French citizens, and they're being killed by their own government, right? Which is, one of the most advanced democracies in the world. And so that also doesn't wash itself out. We still suffer the consequences of those sorts of decisions.
Yeah. I'll end with a final question, which is just reading material. Somebody who's listening to this who wants to learn more about Algeria, both in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century, do you have any suggested reading?
Well, there's quite a bit of stuff, but if you allow me one plug, the book that we're talking in Desert Name Peace was published in English, but there's also an Arabic translation.
Amazing.
That I owe a debt to Hasham al-Rafai, who's a Saudi sociologist who helped me get that translated by a Beiruti publishing house. So some of your Arabophone listeners, I would encourage them to seek that out. Look, there's lots and lots of stuff that is coming out, and the sort of situation that I painted in the beginning about the difficulties of pursuing as a historian the study of colonial violence, I think have largely evaporated. I think now we recognize how important violence is to the history of the place. So, virtually everything and there's a lot of scholarship coming out in English, coming out in French. All of this stuff is valuable. And it's a moment of great effervescence in the field. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in Algerian historiography right now that's commendable. In other words,
go look it up.
And I sort of hesitate we have a couple of minutes to mention 2 or 3 places because there's so much great stuff that's coming out right now. I just, open up wherever you buy your books for and do a search, and anything that's been published the last 10 or 15 years is really, really great.
Cool. Ben, thanks so much. So the book is called A Desert Named Peace: The Violence of France's Empire in the Algerian Sahara, 1844 to 1902. You can find it wherever you find books. Ben, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Mike.